So we're here this morning with Tim Harvey, and we're supposed to be in Spa today, aren't we, Tim?
We are. We should have been at the Nürburgring tonight.
Correct.
And Spa
yes.
tomorrow, but COVID's put paid to that. So here we are in the luxurious RPM Technik
Handover lounge.
showroom.
Yes, in the
What do
handover
you call
lounge.
this? You call this the
executive
VIP
hangover lounge.
VIP
That's
lounge.
it. Yes, but it's probably a worthwhile topic to start with, actually, because COVID-19's had a massive effect on everybody in all sorts of different levels. But how has it changed the racing world? What's happening?
Huge changes, obviously. During lockdown, we had absolutely nothing happening whatsoever.
Yeah.
We've got back to racing initially with club racing, club motorsport, but now national motorsport, touring cars, British GTs all taking place, but obviously with no crowds whatsoever. Touring cars has been deemed an elite sport by the government.
Yeah.
So the Department of Digital Culture and Science have declared it's an elite sport, so we can't have spectators. Ironically, if you go to a clubby meeting at the same venue the next weekend, you can have a certain number of spectators. But that's one of the inconsistencies, but the rule is the rule.
Yeah.
So that's the first problem, is that at the races there's no sense of occasion.
Yeah. Does
Absolutely
it feel like a test day or something?
Yeah, it's so strange. And that's a real shame, because obviously fan engagement, particularly for touring cars, has been a huge part of the story ever since.
Yeah, and so how's it working with the commentary team? Because again, that must be a bit weird. I was watching Le Mans at the weekend, and that was all segregated.
Well, for touring cars, we are under strict protocols from ITV, so we are not allowed in the paddock, we're not allowed in the pits, we're not allowed to go and talk to people. So we have to arrive and go into the TV compound where all the outside broadcast trucks are, and everything's literally in a compound, and we're not allowed to leave. So we literally stay there. So, I mean, like everybody, you have to find new ways of working. So we're now obviously much more engaged sort of on WhatsApp groups and phoning people, and the information stream is quite different. But for me personally, it's always been about face-to-face chats, because I know everybody in the pit lane, and I can walk up and down and have a chat face-to-face, and people will tell me things in a face-to-face conversation that they won't put in a text.
They don't want to put it in writing.
No. And so that's, and obviously that's part of my enjoyment and the social side as well. So I really miss that. That's the biggest downside.
Yeah, I guess the other thing is it's going to be quite hard to see when this may ever change in the short to medium term, I suppose. Yeah,
it is difficult. Obviously, as we speak at the moment, there's a second wave, dare I say it, will certainly increase cases and talk about further restrictions being placed on us. The problem is that, and this is everyone's different, has their own viewpoint, but you can't open things up without the increase of risk of greater infections, and we're trying to open things up economically, and that includes motorsport as well as social, but with it comes a risk, and so we don't know when we will ever get back to what we would consider normal situation.
One thing I noticed from watching Le Mans, there was a couple of cars that were going around with no sponsorship on them. That's surely going to be affected as well ongoing?
Yeah, sponsorship has been affected, but I don't think we'll see the real impact of that until next year.
Right.
Because COVID hit in the UK in March. By that stage, we were literally just about to go racing.
Yeah.
So everybody's sponsorship deals, probably their initial payments had all been made. So the contracts were done, everything was in place, ready to go. And a certain amount of what we're seeing now is people fulfilling contracts in terms of, we want to get something out of what we've done, so we'll go racing. But talk to sponsors and they're very, very guarded about what they might do next year, because they're probably laying people off, they're probably financially struggling themselves, and going racing wouldn't be high on their list of priorities.
Yeah, it's a strange one, isn't it? But have they seen, I don't know what the stats are, have they seen viewing figures go up because people can't go? Is that something they can entice people in with?
That's a benefit.
Yeah.
I think it's due to the fantastic commentary we have on touring cars.
That's why,
but no, motorsport viewing generally has gone up because people are literally watching it at home because they can't go to the races.
And you hear when you interview drivers and things like that, they can actually hear the crowd when you're going round. Has there been any other effects on the drivers from the changes?
Yeah, they love it.
Don't get interrupted.
They're not getting hassled. They don't have to sign autographs. They don't have to fight through crowds.
Yeah.
They absolutely love it.
They must love a bit of that rock star status.
Yeah, of course they do. I'm joking. I mean, part of being a touring car driver is the buzz, the ego. It's the biggest show in town, and people love all that. Of course they do. The drivers love it as well. So they do really miss it. I mean, when they put their crash helmet on, there's no sense of any difference because you're in your zone, you're racing the other cars. The last thing you're doing when you're racing is looking at crowds or anything else. When the race ends, it's all a bit strange because there's no people about. That's a huge anticlimax. Quite often you see the winners get out of the car and they're not quite sure how to celebrate really. So that is different. But fortunately on TV we haven't resorted to artificial crowd noises like football or game shows, so we don't have that, but it's certainly made the interaction different. The interviewing is different, it's just how it is. And the other big thing is we don't have any onboard cameras. We're not allowed to fit onboard cameras because of sanitisation, social distancing, so we've got no onboard shots, and I really miss the onboard shots.
And I guess there must. We've touched on this in the past when chatting. The drivers, the boys and girls, doing a lot more digital racing.
Yes.
Do you think if they're driving their touring car around Brands or wherever, it helps or hinders? What's your point of view?
Sim racing in general has taken off. Absolutely took off during lockdown. Every form of motorsport had a sim racing series. I've never been a big gamer, but I did get involved. I got asked to take part in a Michelin championship, and they kindly sent me a PlayStation 4, and I started getting into it. Initially just using the little controller, then realising I was totally outclassed by every gamer, racing driver,
every 7-year-old out
influencer, you name it, who had a custom seat and pedals. So I went and bought the cheapest seat and pedals I could from Argos, and that made quite a difference. But I didn't go down the 25 grand full sim replica situation. But it's nevertheless, for me, it was an interesting insight, and the guys that are good at it are really good at it. But for me, although the graphics and everything are fantastically realistic, the sense of speed and distance, and obviously the sense of innate danger that comes with that was obviously missing completely. And so there was a huge part of it that wasn't there, and I found quite unnatural. So normally, you'd be approaching a corner and your fear factor would instinctively make you enter brake, and your judgment of speed and distance would take. But in a game, that doesn't happen. You can just sail past, and if you crash, you carry on. And I found that quite difficult. There's no seat of the pants feel for what the car is doing. You react really to what you see it doing on the screen. It's the wrong way around.
So what part of it, because obviously it's massive in F1, these guys spend all their time doing that, don't they? What part of it for those guys is it then? Is it the speed of how everything's happening, or what is it, the reaction time? What is it that they invest so much into it for?
Well, in terms of Formula One, the reason they do so much simulator work is actually engineering development. It's testing development, because their sims are so accurate based on the thousands of sensors that they have on a car. I mean, they reckon that a Formula One car generates more data in one lap than in a whole season 10 years ago of racing. So they have so much data, their sims are hugely accurate. So what they use it for is not driver training, they use it for car engineering. So they'll be in there constantly with the engineers, and they have obviously sim test drivers who you may not have ever heard of, but they're in there all the time. Not the actual race drivers, but they're test drivers. And the engineers are going through a program of spring changes, damper changes, aero changes, all these things, and the drivers are driving it, and they're correlating that back to what they see on the racetrack. I mean, interesting, Lewis Hamilton doesn't spend very much time in sims at all.
Is that right?
And arguably, he's not a bad Formula One driver.
Apparently.
So, the benefits of it are more technical than driver-wise.
Yes.
I mean, the drivers will use it just to sort of give them a refresher, the
Sort of
race
coordination,
drivers, refresher of timing more than anything else when they go to prior to a circuit, gears, you know, if you can, because they're changing gears so fast, you know, if you know you need to go down 4 gears, if you've done it on the simulator, it breeds familiarity and it breeds instinct rather than just going out and blind.
Yes, so we're not going to see you as a sim racer anytime soon?
No.
Have you had a go in an F1?
The only good thing about sim racing is that weight doesn't matter. So
why would that be a conversation?
Well, actually, when your next question, have I ever had a go in a Formula 1 car? It is relevant because when back in 93, 94, when I drove for Renault in touring cars, they obviously supplied Formula 1 engines to Williams Renault. And as part of a PR story, they decided it would be great if myself and Alan Menu, my teammate at Renault Touring Cars, drove the Formula 1 cars. I mean, you can't imagine that now, can you?
Dream tech.
Exactly. But for any racing driver to drive a present day, in other words, a current Formula 1 car, not an old one, but a car of its day. So if you were to ask any racing driver what car he would most like to drive today, it would be Lewis Hamilton's Mercedes, wouldn't it? That would be the car. And back then, the Williams Renault was the car. So Alan and I went down to the old Williams factory in Didcot, as it was then, before they moved to Grove. You're already on stream with where this is going. And back in those days, I weighed 85 kilos in all my kit. So a little less than I do now, but still fairly stocky, if you like. And I physically could not get in the car. I said to them when I get there, I mean, they had tiny cockpits in that era. If you look at the pictures of sort of 93, 94, the drivers are sticking right out of the car.
Yeah, like shoulders.
And the steering wheel is underneath the cockpit. But I said to them, put the smallest seat you've got. He said, we have. So I tried to get in that, and I was wedged about here. So I said, okay, take the seat out and just put a bit of foam in the tub. So they did that, and I got that bit further in, but my knees were under the dash, my feet, there was no way, the pedals were already as far away as they could get. So I said, okay, take all the foam out, I'll just sit on the tub floor, because I was so desperate to drive it. I mean, it would have been incredibly uncomfortable and probably quite unsafe to do that.
Yes.
But in spite of that, I still could not fit in the car. So I actually couldn't drive it. And Alan Menu, who was sort of 65 kilos dripping wet, slipped straight in the car, no problem at all.
Thanks, Tim.
Fitted like a glove, went off, did a test day for them. They said, oh, that was good, Alan. You can, did the PR day, but that all went well. And they said, oh, you can do another day for us if you want. So he had 2 or 3 days in the car. And in fact, I saw a picture of him in the car quite recently, came up on social media, and it sort of brought back all those resentful memories. And it still goes down as my biggest motorsport regret that I wasn't able to do that.
But, as we'll come on to later, allowed you to do some sports car racing though. Quite a lot, apparently.
Yeah.
So yes, leading on from your time in sports cars, and obviously topical, Le Mans just happened this weekend. You raced at Le Mans 4 times, didn't you?
I did, actually. I mean, I'm known as a touring car driver, but I have to say my time in sports cars was probably my most enjoyable time ever. And when people ask me what was your favourite race car, I always say the Group C Spice C1 car, and they sort of look at me with a blank face.
What was that?
But it was a car we did the World Sports Car Championship in with the factory Spice team, with a 3.5 litre Formula 1 engine in the back.
Whoa.
The cars were literally only about 3 seconds slower than a good Formula 1 car time round a track, and they were incredible machines.
What sort of power and weight and that sort of thing?
They were about 750 horsepower, and about 750 kilos.
And lots of aero.
Tons of aero. In those days, we didn't have a flat floor behind the front wheels to the rear wheels and just a diffuser. Literally down either side of the tub was a huge Venturi. So if you imagine a diffuser that was the length of the car and 750 kilos and 700 horsepower, you can imagine what performance those cars had.
Do you remember your first test in one of them?
Well, I'd sort of built up to it because I'd done the British Sports Car Championship in C2 machinery for a couple of years, and that had sort of built me up to it. I mean, my first real experience of driving the C1 Spice was just blew my mind, really, because I think it came after a winter of doing nothing, and then I got straight into this car. And I was so far behind the car mentally when I first started. You know, the car was getting down the road so fast that mentally I was sort of a second or so behind it. So the car was almost taking me for a drive, and it took a day to acclimatise just to the speed.
I imagine, back then they didn't have the same sort of data you have now, so did someone just get back in and they did the time and went, you need to go faster, mate?
Well, no, we did have a fair bit of data in the car. We had a fair bit of data, so they did know what was going on and everything else. But I mean, we talked about Spa, we should have been there tomorrow, but you know, if you went through Eau Rouge in a Group C car at 160 plus miles an hour, honestly, you couldn't breathe. The compression,
get ready for it.
It was like being winded. The compression and direction change winded you, and it wasn't until you got to the top of the hill that you suddenly went and started breathing again. And however hard you thought, I can breathe, that's ridiculous, you couldn't do it.
Is it flat in one of them?
It was not quite flat.
They can see the data.
It was one of those ones, not quite flat.
So the air again, was the aero the biggest eye opener, or was it the power, 1-to-1 power to weight ratio?
The aero was a huge part of it, but also they had really wide tyres, very grippy tyres, and an F1 engine. But we had an F1 engine that you still had to manually shift, and it wasn't even sequential. So and the gate was so fine, and you missed a shift in one of those, you would instantly blow the engine. I mean, instantly. So you had to be really careful on your shifting, or if you shifted down too early and buzzed the engine, because they had no flywheel on them, they rev so fast. I mean, we used to get fined if we were like 200 revs over on a down change, we'd get fined 100 quid.
It's taken like 4 hours off the engine.
So you had to be really careful. But I mean, so it was a very physical environment. You're changing gear properly. You're in an enclosed Group C car. You're travelling very fast. I mean, it was the fastest thing I ever drove.
Full stop across the whole career.
And to do the whole World Championship as we did in 1990 was absolutely fantastic. I mean, we were racing against the Silk Cut Jaguars, the Sauber Mercedes with Schumacher, Frentzen, the Nissans, the Porsches, all the ultimate era of
stuff that everyone's now really got really interested in again, haven't they?
And so, back to your original question, when people say what are you most proud of, well, I stood on the podium on an 1,000-kilometre World Sports Car race. That's quite
it's a big gold ticked.
But yes, but people don't know that. They just associate me with the Sierra Cosworths and BMWs.
Just those normal ones.
Those ordinary shopping cars.
So in your first Le Mans, was it a case that you'd obviously been racing the season anyway, so you got used to it, or was it kind of like, oh my God, I'm going to race at Le Mans in 2 days' time? Back
to Le Mans specifically, it was my first year doing the World Sports Car Series. I was actually doing it in a Group C2 Tiger with a Porsche 956 engine in it, run by Charles Ivey, the Fulham independent Porsche dealer. And the money was coming from my co-driver Wayne Taylor from South Africa, who subsequently went on to have a successful career in IMSA in America, and now runs a very successful IMSA sports car team himself. And the car was very quick, but didn't do very good fuel mileage, as you'd expect with a twin turbo 956 engine. But when we went to Le Mans, I mean, the car was fantastic. It was very quick on lap times because it was so fast down the straight. It didn't have the frontal area of a Group C1 car, but it had the grunt. So we were very quick there. But I'd never been to Le Mans. I'd never been to watch. I'd never physically been there myself. So my first lap, and this was on the circuit without the chicanes in the straight. So my first lap, and we were 220 down the straight. So it was an incredible experience, and we had an eventful race, but we finished. There's so many stories I could think of just relating to that one race. It was a hugely emotional moment. I mean, I've always followed Le Mans. It was in the old pits, with the sort of alleyway at the back full of body panels, and there was no real working environment there. It was so different.
And with the old Mulsanne Straight, before we go on to the other bits, first time you went down there, it was just intuition, but how do you start to pick your braking points when you go, because you can't have gone that fast on any other circuit on the planet, I don't think.
No, I mean, obviously Monza and Hockenheim in those days were fairly quick circuits.
Yeah.
Hockenheim didn't have the chicanes, it was a long straight, but nothing could quite prepare you for that. And it is a strange sensation, especially if you go out on brand new tyres and the car jiggles about and moves about a bit. But the thing about the Le Mans Straight is that it goes up at the end towards, so your horizon view is a long way away, and it is dead straight, so you can literally look at the horizon, and you have not the sense of speed that you would expect until you have to avoid something in the road, like a piece of broken bodywork or something, or somebody stopped at the side of the road, and you pass them so fast. As soon as you see them, you'll pass them because you're covering so many meters per second at 200 plus mile an hour. And the other thing is that you can't steer around something. So if you suddenly see a piece of bodywork in the road, you can't steer around it. You can, at that speed, you can only guide the car slightly left and slightly right. You can't go like that.
No.
It's quite a different sensation.
And then picking braking point as well, that must take a few laps to get into your...
Yeah, I'm sure the first time I braked, I probably had to accelerate again for the corner. But you know, as a racing driver, you quickly get that sense of speed and distance and pick your braking points.
Yeah, and physically, it's probably got to be the most physical motorsport event in cars, at least, that you can do. What did you have to do training before it, or did you just sort of race fit?
Actually, Le Mans is one of the easier races.
Okay.
Because you spend a lot of time effectively on a straight or going flat out. Places like Spa, places like Daytona, much harder physically actually to do a 24-hour race. But Le Mans is relatively not too bad.
Yeah.
And I mean, you will see drivers triple stint nowadays. I mean, we used to double stint then.
What does that mean in terms of
that
timing?
means that you would do a complete tank of fuel, stay in the car, refuel, possibly change tyres or keep the same tyres on, and do another stint. So that's a double stint.
Oh, right, okay. So it's dictated by fuel, basically.
Yeah, fuel is always your dictator how long your stint is, and it's usually, can be 12, 13, 14 laps depending on the car.
And the endurance part of it from a psychological point of view, or just get in and do the job?
Actually, it's an amazing drug, adrenaline. And when you're in a race environment, it just keeps you going. You have to remember to eat, you have to remember to drink your fluids, you have to remember to try and take some rest. And every driver's slightly different. Some drivers don't sleep at all during a 24-hour race. Others will sort of catnap a bit with one eye half open, and others will go zonk out for a couple of hours and they're absolutely fine. But generally the pattern at Le Mans is that it's slightly different now, but in my day, each driver would drive a stint to start with, a fuel stint, so you'd all have had an hour in the car, and then you'd go into double stinting, especially as you go into night and you're keeping the same tyres on because it's cooler. But when you're double stinting, you've effectively got 4 hours off if there's two other drivers doing double stints. So you have got a bit of a break.
To relax,
But I could never really get away from it. I always wanted to be in the garage, I always wanted to be looking at the lap time every time, what other cars are doing. I found it very difficult to sort of really rest during the meeting.
Because the speed sensation, just when you're in a car, like this time of the year, the days are now getting shorter, and you start driving occasionally at night time, and you go, oh Christ, it feels fast. It must be double speed.
Yeah, although at night there's two things at Le Mans. In June when they race, the night is quite short.
Okay.
Obviously they've just raced now in September, and they've actually had nearly 12 hours of darkness, so a little bit different. But in June, when you traditionally race Le Mans, the night is quite short. But also what tends to happen is, instinctively the circuit, where you are, and you get tunnel vision. So it's almost like driving an arcade. You've got the lights obviously that are on full beam all of the time, and you know where you are on the circuit because you know it anyway. And in fact, there's no distractions. There's no things that you see that can distract your vision. So it just becomes like driving an arcade game. And the thing about Le Mans is you're trying to drive the perfect lap every lap, and the perfect lap is not stressing the car too much, not hitting the curbs too much, making sure your gear changes are neat. Nowadays it's easy because it's paddles, but in those days it was clutch and move the lever. And you're trying to drive that perfect lap every lap, not get held up with traffic, do your passes at the right time, all that kind of thing. It's a technical exercise. Now it's become a sprint race for 24 hours.
Yeah.
But in my day, it was a little bit about looking after the car as well.
Because touring cars being the total opposite. Did you think when you were driving, you were like, I'm driving at 95% here, to give the car a bit of mechanical sympathy, or was it like 0.5% of giving it some sympathy?
It's a bit like we talk about on track days, you know, where you can drive the car at 95 to 98% of its ability and go very nearly as fast as the car is capable of going. That extra 3% absolutely rags the car.
Destroys them.
Rags it for not a lot more gain in speed. And that mechanical sympathy is something you just develop. And in fact, most GT endurance type drivers find that they can go nearly as fast in the race as they would in qualifying when they're all screwed up to do the mega lap. They go nearly as fast with very little effort because they just get into perfect timing, perfect driving, and it's just about finding that rhythm.
Yes, yeah. And so the year you won your class, who were your other drivers that you raced with? Do you remember?
Chris Hodgetts, John Sheldon.
And it's one of the only sort of, I suppose, driver type events where it strikes me from watching at the weekend, it's the whole team. I mean, it always is. Obviously, it's always, but even more so in that event.
I would say it's the ultimate team motorsport event that there is. Everybody's involved. We've seen at Le Mans so many times, the race is not won until the car crosses the line. You know, it can fail like the Toyota did 2 years ago on the very last lap of the race. So nobody ever takes anything for granted. You know, the most infuriating TV interview with a driver that I see at Le Mans time and time again is, so you're in a great position now, you're 2 laps ahead,
No.
you know, you've just got to bring the car home. And the driver will sort of, you know, think, yeah, but we're not there until we're get there, and anything can happen. And they will always say, yeah, but there's a long way to go, even when there's really not very long in the 24 hours, because every driver, every member of the team knows it can go wrong just like that.
And with that last hour, as you coming up to the finish, you must be listening for every tiny little bit.
I mean, I was lucky the first year I did it, because I'd put the team or the deal together. I did the qualifying, I did the start of the race, I did the session into the night.
Changed tyres.
Did a session in the did a session in the night. I did the dawn session, and I finished the race. So I did all the best bits of the race. And I can honestly say, I mean, it was actually that first year was the year Jaguar won as well in '88. So it was a massive year. And you know, when I finished that race, I was driving around with a huge lump in my throat because of the whole emotion of the event, the team involvement, the atmosphere. I mean, an incredible event. I've never experienced anything like that.
And the most ludicrous parties afterwards?
No, because it's all too knackered. All too knackered. I mean, honestly, I mean, there's always a bit of a sense of anticlimax after a race anyway. You know, everyone packs up and disappears, and
goes back to their lives.
There'll be a moment when you're sort of on your own and you think, well, what really just happened? What did I just do? You know, and it's only when you look back at it afterwards that you remember just how special a moment it is. And
did you ever have, over those 4 years, well, I guess you must have stints in the wet, what's it like?
I mean, driving Le Mans in the wet at night is the most scary experience that you can ever have. I mean, it really is difficult. Or the fog, but they will generally bring in safety cars and things now. But it's, you know, it's not pleasant, but you have to get on with it. You just have to get on with it. You know, you can imagine how long the rooster tails hang in the air, you know, in the wet. So you're never really driving cleanly. It's like following a lorry at 200 miles an hour and not knowing really what's there.
I guess you've got to trust that the guy in front's not going to do anything daft.
Yeah, but, you know, if he aquaplanes and, you know, rattles off the barriers either side, you're not going to be able to do too much about it.
What's the rule with that? You just aim straight or aim for the car or something, doesn't that what they say?
It depends. I mean, you know, there's a little rule that says you should always aim for where the car is, on the basis that when you get there, it will carry on in whatever direction it's going.
Yeah.
You know, there's no right or wrong, but that's a general. But you have to just go with your instincts.
See what's happening. And I guess at the time it wouldn't have been something that entered your psyche. But looking back on it now and the differences in safety between the late 80s and now, does it make you sure?
Yeah, it does. I mean, you know, sadly we lost a lot of good drivers at Le Mans, or in sports car racing of that era, certainly in Group C. And you know, you look back and the cars weren't particularly safe. You know, our feet were very near the front bulkhead. You know, obviously we didn't have carbon tubs and things like that. We had aluminium tubs or space frame cars. So it very different safety standards. The circuits weren't as safe. But at the time, you think it's the safest thing that there is. You know, because it's the latest.
I'm strapped in. I'm tight. It's fine.
So you just get on with it.
Yeah. Did you ever have any shunts in world sports cars?
I didn't have any big shunts in sports cars, touch wood. I had plenty of shunts in everything else. Never a big one in that.
No, interesting. So going on from sports car racing, we were chatting the other week about if you'd ever raced air-cooled 911s, and lo and behold you had, and sent me a quite an interesting clip of you racing in the 993, was it a Carrera Cup or Super Cup race? Super Cup race. Yeah. And the racing was interesting, but right at the start, I noticed that your technician was Roland Kausmal.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Well, it was 1994.
Yeah.
I was obviously raced height of touring cars in the UK. The annual Super Cup race at the Grand Prix was coming up, and Porsche would run 2 VIP cars at each race for local drivers. So myself and Kelvin Burt were asked to do the British round of the Porsche Super Cup in their VIP cars. And part and parcel of that package was an invitation to go out to Weissach, to have a look around the factory, to have a sort of tutorial with a cup car, and a drive around the Weissach test track. And Roland was the man that met us, escorted us, told us and instructed us on the whole process.
Because he's a bit of a legend in the Porsche.
He is. Yeah. I didn't know particularly this. You know, it's my first sort of experience of a cup car.
Yeah.
Obviously, I'd had some involvement with Porsche through the Group C stuff, but it was my first real initiation into Weissach and Porsche Cup and everything else.
So what happened when you went to Weissach? How did that work?
Well, I mean, he took us round, showed us the production line, talked us through the car technically. He took us out. He took me out in a cup car and drove me around Weissach. So being driven by Roland was pretty impressive. And obviously he'd done 1 million laps around there.
Yeah.
And for him, it was literally like going to the shops, but at very high speed, because he was just so relaxed behind the wheel.
Yeah.
And then I drove the car just to understand the controls and things. But yeah, he was a good communicator and obviously a very good driver, and a very relaxing guy to be around.
Yeah, even mannered. And how did a 993 Cup car compare to the touring car of the day?
Well, pretty different, really. Weight distribution was so different to me. The driving technique was very different. And the 993 cars, you know, you look back at any of those, if you can find some YouTube footage of it, the cars move around hugely. They're bouncing off everything. They're like this, and I mean, the car, there was a lot of work involved in driving one of those, because it was so easy to overdrive it and lose momentum. And controlling that weight transfer was really quite an art. I would say there was a lot more technique in terms of driving those cars than there are the current cars, which are much more stable, paddle shifts, etc., much more user friendly. But it was a great experience. I clicked with the car straight away, really enjoyed it.
I assume touring car would have been faster back in the day though?
I don't know. No, I think probably they'd have been similar, because in that time, 94, we were in the middle of the super touring era, and they were pretty
Is that the big money era when
that's the
manufacturers would chuck in?
Yeah. So it was, I mean, I don't know, it would have been fairly equal, I would have guessed, but I'd suggest the Porsche might have still had the legs of the...
Because I was trying to work out now, I couldn't see very easily, but there's not much between them now either, is there? A cup car and a touring car?
Yeah, a cup car is faster.
It is, yeah.
A cup car is faster, definitely. Yeah. At every circuit we go to in the UK, the cup car, Carrera Cup GB, is faster than the touring car.
I suppose power is...
Power and grip. You know, they've got a very sticky Michelin control tyre, and the cars are quick. They're 485 horsepower. So in all regards, they are quicker than a super touring car. Sorry, than an NGTC car.
Yes, and in terms of you touched on driving style and you gelled with it quite quickly. Was there any? Did you think before you drove it, okay, rear engine just going to be a bit different, just get in and go?
No, I think in those days I always considered myself a pretty versatile driver. I started off in single-seaters, I'd gone into sports cars, I raced touring cars. In the late 80s I was racing sports cars and touring cars at the same time. So I always considered myself fairly versatile, if you like. So I didn't give it an awful lot of thought in terms of, well, this is different, difficult. I just enjoyed the experience.
Because there can't be that many drivers that have raced in air-cooled 996, 997, raced in 991.
I didn't ever race 991 actually.
But you've driven, I know you've driven a fair few of them. Yeah. So if first of all you kind of grouped together sort of the 993 and 996, was it like a stellar jump between the two of them? Or?
Yeah, I mean every one got significantly better.
Yeah.
In exactly the same way.
When you say better, do you mean just outright faster, basically?
Faster. Yeah, better for a racing driver just means faster. But I mean, you know, in the same way that they mirrored their road car equivalents, you know, in terms of platform stability, engine power, everything was better. You know, everything just got better. Obviously 996, as we said, was originally a manual gate. 997 we started to get sequential. 991 went to paddles. So that all became quite different. But mainly with any Porsche racing car, it's all about controlling the weight transfer of the car, because that, you know, the physics are still there, the engine is still in the back, and yes, the road cars have got better at managing that, and so have the race cars, but you still have to fine-tune your technique to get the best out of it.
So which age car do you think was the trickiest to get the best lap time from?
Well, actually, probably originally the 993. But from my racing experience, probably the 996. 996 was a good compromise. It was more advanced, obviously, than 993 as a proper racing car, but still required an awful lot of really good control inputs, steering, braking, throttle, on, off, how you did it to control the weight and manage the tyres. That was probably the trickiest one. Probably the most enjoyable was 997, actually, because that was just another evolution better, but still a very analog car to drive.
And did you have, when racing cup cars, do you have a different car every season, or was there some seasons where you just have the same as last year because there wasn't any evolution in the road car?
Yeah, I mean, we would always try and have a brand new car every year, purely, even if there weren't any regulation or evolutions of the car, purely because in Carrera Cup there are no drop scores allowed, and so you're trying to rule out any mechanical issues. And if you buy a brand new car, you knew you could life on every component from zero in terms of maintenance and everything else. So it was more about a reliability issue than performance. There was no performance advantage in a new car, but it meant that you could life everything from zero. And generally my cars were fairly successful, so they would sell at the end of the previous year quite well. And then it was worth buying a new one.
Did you ever get in a new one and think, oh, it doesn't feel like my old slipper of my last one?
No, the cars were all so similar. You never got that feeling, and you could jump from one car to another and be immediately on it from the first flying lap. There was never any great difference between them.
So you didn't ever have a soft spot for a particular car that you're like, that's my car?
No.
It's just a tool to further your career.
Yeah, but they were all, because the build was all really good. You could never really tell the difference. Occasionally one car would have a slightly better engine than another.
Yeah.
But you'd only really see it on the data for whatever reason, and then you'd want the engine out of that one in your car. But
swap it back. With the 991s, am I right in saying that it was easier to drive faster to a point?
Yeah, it's easier for an amateur to drive a 991, definitely. An amateur jumping in a 991 can get closer to a professional's time than you would, say, in a 997 or 996 or 993. Yeah, for sure.
And is it proportionally larger as you went older?
Yes.
Yeah. It's just because, like you were saying, it's a trickier thing. And is that down to knowing how they set the car up for themselves, or is it just driver talent?
No, it's just the car is more forgiving.
Yeah.
And therefore less requirement for the driver to have delicate control inputs.
Yes.
You could be rougher with a 991 and get away with it.
Yeah.
And the same action in a 996 would have caused you a moment.
Yes. And am I right in saying, because they don't run ABS in any of the Cup cars, but that is one of the trickiest things to balance, because you can destroy a set of tyres quite quick otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, inevitably, the inside front tyre is the least loaded. So if you're braking into a right-hand bend, the right-hand front tyre becomes unweighted as the weight transfer goes.
Which you see in the
left.
photos sometimes.
So then it's very easy to lock that up. So the skill of braking as hard as you can whilst turning is a real art form.
Yeah.
Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to get to the point at which you can apply the throttle as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
So you're trying to reduce that braking area, so you're on the throttle on the straight, say, for as long as possible, reduce the distance from starting to brake to when you then get back on the throttle to accelerate the car.
Yeah.
You're trying to reduce that as much as you can. So there's a real art form in braking in a Super Cup or in a Carrera Cup car. And the drivers that are in those cars all of the time, and a lot of the Super Cup drivers will do Super Cup and German Carrera Cup. So they're literally in the cars all the time.
Yeah.
And they get this absolute fine technique, which just translates into lap time.
Is it a bit weird when you then drive, say you're RS500, you'd swap over and you go, hang on, this is totally weird, this is totally different?
It certainly would be if you got out of an RS500.
Well, yeah,
But I mean, where you see it nowadays is when you have drivers who would be really dominant in Super Cup or Carrera Cup, then they go off and drive GT3 cars in international GT racing with ABS, traction control, and then they come back and get into the Cup car and they can't get to where they were before very quickly because it's such a specialist technique.
And when you look at, if anyone's ever had a close look around a Cup car, I think how strong they look, and if I was going to have an accident, I'd have an accident in one of those. Yeah. Did you ever have any biggies?
I never had, again, touch with a biggie in a Cup car, but I saw lots of big accidents. Yeah. And the cars always survived really well.
Yeah.
You think about Kelvin Burt going over the barrier at Thruxton.
Yeah.
Lots of other big accidents, but the drivers have always been pretty much okay. They are a strong little car.
Well, hopefully we never test that. But I think that's been really interesting. And if anyone has any topics that Tim and I you think might be interesting to listen to, pop it in the comments, and we'll have a think about whether we do that. But we hope you found that interesting.